Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of ClearPoint Unlock. My name is Bryce Scanlon, and joining me today in the studio, I have got Erika from Volition and Dan from our design studio. If I could get you each to introduce yourself, that would be excellent.
Kia ora. Thanks, Bryce. I'm Erika Butters, and I am the founder of Volition. Previous to this, I was working as the director of the Personal Advocacy and Safeguarding Adults Trust, which is New Zealand's only independent disability advocacy organisation. So it gave me a really privileged view of what was working well and what was not working well in the disability sector, and the foundation for understanding what, therefore, we could do to shake things up.
Nice.
And I'm Dan Cornwall. I lead design at ClearPoint and had the huge privilege of being able to work with Erika and her team on moving the design forward for the Volition app.
Erika, could you tell the audience a little bit about Volition, please?
Yeah, sure. So Volition is a social enterprise. We are pretty new in that we've just launched our app this year, but what our mission is to empower disabled people as the decision makers in their own life, and we're trying to use accessible technology to do that.
That's great. And how many users do you have currently?
We have about 250 active users, but that's not the metric that we're measuring.
No.
Hard this early in the game. We're actually focusing more on engagement and making sure that the app is sticky, that people are coming back to it, that they are getting benefit and value out of using it, and the total number of users right now is kind of a side point.
Erika, I remember hearing from you, was it last year sometime? We were chatting away and Fabian had sent you in our direction.
That's right.
And there was a bit of a challenge. Can you explain what that challenge was? What were you going through?
Yes. So Fabian, for those that don't know, is our lead solutions architect, and he is part of the ClearPoint family in the past. And he had done the beginning part of our build, where he had built all of the database and the information infrastructure, a lot of the workflows, where he had started working on the interface. But in the meantime, I think we'd gone through our third designer. Now, we were friendly with them. I promise we weren't burning them. It was that we were taking volunteer hours, pro bono work at that stage. And so it means that there were designers that were coming in that were offering very generously of their time and doing bits and pieces. But that meant that we got to a point where we had a little bit of a bits and pieces design. And when I think back on it, it seems a little bit like it was a hamster wheel. Every designer that came in had a very clear artistic focus and direction, and that meant that some things did get reinvented multiple times. The other thing that was, I guess, a complicating factor at this time was that we had just had an accessibility audit of all of our designs, and that's super important to us, making sure that what we're building is accessible and can be evidenced as being accessible. And so a lot of the design changes that were happening were necessary as well to tick off all of the requirements of our accessibility audit. But the pickle we found ourselves in was a bits and pieces design file that was not necessarily following any one design system, and an accessibility audit that we had started but not finished.
So Erika, what was it specifically that you needed ClearPoint to do?
I had a long wish list, but like I'm learning everything in software development, you need to cull it down to an MVP. What is the minimum that you need, and focus on that. And so what we came to ClearPoint asking for ClearPoint to do as our minimum was to tidy up our designs, get our Figma file in a state that was now coherent and had a design system implemented, and to go through that accessibility audit that we had and to make sure that the designs were ticking off each of the requirements and the things that we had been pulled up on as not quite meeting before. And so that did mean that there was a bit of evolution to do in the design and some of the colors. I remember talking about colors a lot, colors that met the contrast ratios that we were aiming for. So yeah, a lot of accessibility stuff, Figma file, tidy, make it coherent.
I think one of the things that's important from a design perspective is meeting the need. And I think the thing we really took on board was that this wasn't an opportunity for yet another designer to come and change everyone's mind and wax lyrical about the direction. And although we needed to go into colors because accessibility is hard and trying to get contrast ratios are hard. And then the semantic meanings of certain colors for different cultures is hard. But, as a startup and trying to create a product for the first time, the job to be done was to, design as quickly as possible, try and pull everything together so that we could actually get to build. So I think that was kind of laser focus from the beginning. And hopefully we were able to kind of keep that focus on getting stuff that will move everything forward.
Yeah, and I guess the other half of this question is, what were we specifically asking ClearPoint to not do?
Yes.
And that was, like I said to Dan, I don't want you to come in and make an entirely new look to this, because we've had some iterations. We're actually pretty happy and solid with what we've got, and we've had different designers that have wanted to inject different looks and directions, and we don't want that right now. We need to spend all of the time focused on that consolidation and doing the thing.
And I hope we were respectful about that.
Absolutely.
We were. Good. And I remember, Erika, you were down in Wellington. We were up here in Auckland. And I think Dan and I jumped onto a Google Meet or something similar to chat with you.
I was so impressed, because my recollection is that it was literally the day that Fabian's floated the ideas, like, there is a way that we could get out of this pickle pretty quickly. I think it was the same day that we jumped on the call. And I was, very impressed.
No, that's great. What do you remember, Dan? What do you remember about the challenge and talking with Erika in the early days?
I'd probably be more generous. I mean, actually, full props to you. You had already actually built the entire app yourself as a proof of concept. And so, as a starting point, to have all those ideas kind of already cooked is, it's a huge place to start from.
Maybe should just qualify that I'm not a technical founder. I don't have any coding or software development skills. I had used Bubble, which is a no-code platform, to build out a proof of concept that then was almost like a blueprint for going into a build, but it was not pretty. Still needed a lot of design refinement.
I can't remember, was that what the accessibility audit was done on, or another layer after that?
The accessibility audit was done on the first version of our interface, which was done by our first designer, who did an awesome job, again, volunteering her time, and then she needed to duck out because the end of her volunteering had come, and so that's when we then got into a succession of a few others.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge of volunteering, right? Is that you can only really give what you can give. And I would probably describe the starting point we were at. In design, we talk about the diamond approach of diverging and then converging. The challenge is that if you diverge but don't get a chance to converge, the state of design was that there were a lot of different ideations. And so then there's a really clear vision of where it needs to go, but then how do you bring it back together? Because you've got a developer waiting with hot little hands saying, I need one vision, not three.
Yeah, totally. And I like that diamond visual, because we were at the widest point of the diamond, I think, where we'd had something consolidated in our first version of the designs. Then between accessibility audits and different designers coming in, it had been unpacked and really pulled apart.
Yeah.
And it was at that point that I was a little bit panicking. Yeah.
And I think some of the accessibility questions, they kind of take something that's resolved and open it back up again, right? So it probably is the right thing to go, there is a number of different ways we could solve this.
Yeah, necessary.
It takes time to get there, and it's hard if you're volunteering to get enough time.
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
And I remember, obviously, we're not a volunteering organisation, so it was quite a challenge at the start trying to work out, what's the budget or what can we work on? And at the end of the day, I suppose, we want to make sure we're giving great value for money, no matter how big or small that engagement. Could you talk openly about how you felt about, engaging with ClearPoint?
Yeah. What I was hungry for and what ClearPoint was able to deliver on was being able to say, this is when I need you to work and how much I need you to work and what I need you to do. And that kind of direction is really challenging to give in a volunteering space. And so we were able to ring fence and say, this is the amount of budget that I have to now put towards this. And these are the ideal
outcomes,
milestones that we will reach, the outcomes that we will get to. And then I had in the back of my head kind of a tolerance of, and if we need a little bit more, and if I get to the point and I'm enjoying it so much that I want to do a little bit more, then we could. And we did end up doing that. We did end up extending a little bit.
And do you remember, Dan, giving some sort of, sizing to the amount of work that Erika needed from us?
Yeah. So, as we said, there were a number of different directions. And so there was a challenge of kind of bringing them in to make something that would be suitable for development. And so we could kind of assess based on what we could see, what we could do with what already existed, and what we would need to do to the Figma file. Because the dirty little secret of design is that you've kind of got to engineer the Figma file in such a way that it's going to be suitable for development. So lots of reusable components and things like that. There were also things that were still question marks that we needed to resolve. And so that's probably the harder thing, is how do we solve those problems? The answer is going to be down the line, and that'll tell us how much effort's needed for that. And I think the accessibility is also almost very unique for this, because, you do designs for, let's say, government or corporate, and, everyone wants it to be accessible, but only so accessible, right? So just enough that it meets guidelines and there's a backdoor entrance if somebody's visually impaired. The nature of this app is that it's directly dealing with an audience and a wide range of audiences that have a wide range of needs. And so that's one of the really important challenges, is how do we design for all of those different permutations? So that's actually one of the most interesting challenges of it.
It might help, Erika, if you talked about some of your users and the different challenges that they have.
Yeah, my background is in supported decision-making, which is a concept that is at its core about empowering each person to retain and exercise their own legal decision-making rights. And so that's underpinning all of the Volition philosophy and mission. And the app is therefore most valuable as a tool for people that have intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, or older adults that might have dementia or other forms of cognitive decline. It's also really helpful for people that might be experiencing episodic periods of mental illness and distress. Because what the app does is it's a digital preference bank. It's a place for decision makers. That's the word that we use to describe our users. It's a place for decision makers to capture and store the information about everything that's important to them and how they want to receive support. And then they share that information with the agencies or individuals that provide them with support. And it's built in such a way that the people that are closest to them can collaborate and help to build out that picture. And so that means that decision makers might be using it for capturing and communicating information about everyday things like food preferences or intolerances or hobbies and how they want to spend their time. But it can also then extend to planning for some really significant life stuff like advanced care planning and what do you want to happen at the end of your life. So it's quite broad in what it's intended to capture. And even though anyone in the general population could absolutely get value out of using it, it definitely is most valuable for those that might otherwise struggle to communicate what's important to them.
So growing the audience for Volition app, how's that going to happen? What are your next steps?
We are working in a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
We're working to try and reach directly with decision makers through their community, which is also our community. Sitting in the green room, I don't know if you call it a green room, next to us is Neville, who is our chief advisor and who has a learning disability, because something that is really core to our approach is that there's nothing about us without us, that we are building this with and for disabled people. So Neville is the local area president for People First, which is the disabled persons organisation for learning disability, and we're going out through the People First network as well as other disabled persons organisations. And then the other prong is reaching out to supporters and family members that are also Volition users with a different hat on.
Yeah.
And in our early cohort of users, and I mentioned earlier that the thing we're focusing on the most right now is that stickability and how much engagement there is. This group of supporters and parents and family members, right now, they're the ones that are absolutely the most engaged. So we're reaching out to them, again, through the communities that they're already participating in, which are quite strong. And then we also are going out through the provider agencies that serve disabled people in their whānau, because I guess the business structure that undersits all of this mission and impact is that we give tools to disabled people and we deliver data insights to service providers. And so we're going through the service providers as a distribution channel to propagate the app itself, but building a commercial relationship with the providers as well.
That's such an exciting journey, Erika. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Exciting's one word,
Yeah.
also challenging and intimidating and all of the things.
Oh, that's great. What about the app itself changing over time? Are you getting a bit of feedback from those early initial users, and is it doing much in terms of the layout or the capability of the app?
Yep. So we've already made some changes with layout. Dan, you might be interested to hear that early on when you came on in our flow, this is going to get a little bit specific, but not too specific. Early on in our flow, when you're creating a preference, it started with choosing multiple categories to put your preference in, like how do you want to box this? Which box does it go in? And then you went in and added additional details. And the accessibility audit told us actually it's a little bit confusing because it creates some branching opportunity very early on in the process. And so we flipped it. That was one of your suggestions, was to add the categories at the end so there's not branching because it's the end. And so we did that. And then now with some early user feedback has been that they really want to see categories at the beginning because it's a launch pad for their thinking to think about what types of preferences they might be adding and going into the flow of adding this information without having that prompt was a bit hard. And so that's something that we've now flipped again, but we've tried to tick the accessibility audit recommendation by removing the branching possibility. So you can only choose one category at the beginning. And then at the end, that's where we get back to adding additional categories. That got too specific. But we are getting a lot of feedback. We are getting feedback both for the UI and potential tweaks, enhancements to the flows, but also a lot of suggestions, requests for future features. And so we're now at this point where we could branch in
multiple ways.
A million different ways. There's so many different things we could do from here to add value. And so continuing that conversation with our users and getting that feedback and adding some weighting to the many different recommendations, that's where we're at.
I think that raises, it's a great example of, I guess, some of the key design challenges with making an app that is powerful and complex enough to be able to deal with a wide range of somebody's life. So it's not just food preferences, but could be any number of things, morning, day, or night. And it might be for different scenarios. We talked about the decisions that are relevant when you go to the hospital and you might be talking to a health carer versus, when you're going shopping or eating out. And so those range of preferences and then translating those into design.
Yeah.
Because we're trying to add contrast so that people can know what they're picking as far as categories. And I think, we talked a lot about how might you interpret different phrasings of words or semantically, what do different pictures mean depending on your on your current state?
Yeah, I remember one of the things that we spent a bit of time on was we were wanting to find a way to have kind of like not a hierarchy of preferences, but a way of signaling that these preferences are more important than those preferences. But some of the traditional language that is used in design just did not work in this context. So, for example, you couldn't favorite a preference because what if it was a preference about something you hated, that you hate tomatoes? You don't want to call that your favorite. And so we played around a lot with the language of the design as well as the visuals and the experience of it.
I think that was one of my key learnings was when we talk about accessibility, so many conventions that we have in design only really work at full speed with an audience who can spend the time to go through it. But as a tool, it's a communication device between, it might be a family member who's constantly a carer or someone who's just the carer for that day. There's a lot for it to carry between those two people to make sure that they actually understand what they're trying to communicate to each other. And so that's a really interesting kind of design challenge because you can't just follow the conventions and say, well, we're going to have these tick boxes and we're going to have a little menu over here. It's going to be hidden under a drop down. Well, if it's hidden, will it get found?
Yeah.
All of those things that you take for granted don't factor anymore.
Yeah, totally.
Can I ask the question? You're both working remote, doing this together, and it was quite a short engagement, but did it feel natural working, in different areas, just seeing each other on the screen and using tools? Was it okay?
For me, it did, but that's also my MO. Like I work remotely first, pretty much always.
Okay.
We took advantage of different platforms and tools to make it work. Like we used Slack a lot. I think we obviously communicated through Figma comments, and the first time that Dan did a sweep of the file and did a whole bunch of designs, and then I came in and did a sweep of the file and added comments everywhere, I know I definitely freaked him out because there were too many comments. But yeah, we made it work.
No, I think it's a good thing. And that's the real change that we've had since COVID, right? Is having these tools that enable us to go through stuff. And, when you actually unpack an app and you think, oh, it's only 4 or 5 screens, and it's actually like 100 screens and permutations underneath, you kind of need that to-do list. And it's interesting, right? Because in design, those comments kind of become our JIRA of where are we at? And it's never just, this is a bug. It's like, I have a question. I have a question about your question. And so it provides, you can kind of thread all of those conversations.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. And then when you finished, were you a happy customer, Erika?
I was a very happy customer because, like I said, I was hungry for being able to define some specific outcomes and milestones being reached, and we absolutely did. And I inherited a file that was beautifully clean, and we now had an atomic design system implemented that I had heard about before, but we didn't have it before. And so that has stood us in good stead for then doing the iterations that came after, because it, like with any product, there's not really a line
and
and
date. Keeps going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's not an end date. So we've kept on evolving and growing and changing it. But we now had a really super strong foundation to do that from, whereas before it was the widest part of the diamond.
That's great. Dan, is there anything you want to add?
I'm curious how the build journey went. So once you had the design file and it's off to make the app, I guess the thing that had been top of mind was, I always think of kind of designers serving 3 kind of circles, right? So we've got our main users, and then we've got the business and the product goal, which means we've got the requirements we want to get in front of the users, and we have to make that work. But it also has to be buildable. And, we can design a whole lot of stuff that's beautiful, but we can't do it. I think we had certain conversations where we're like, this would be the ideal solution. Yep. And Fabian's like, yeah, that's not going to be possible in the first round. So I'm just curious, how did that turn out when you entered the build?
What we have built and what is live now is very close. Like, there's only a few things that after you handed the file over fell into the bucket of too complex for MVP. Pretty much everything else was over the line. The build process in some ways had some parallels with the design process, in that we had been using some volunteer developers, which meant that there's a different set of challenges in coordinating that. Beautiful people that are volunteering their time. And then because we now had a design system that was built from the atomic level up, it meant that the build process could follow that same pattern, and we were able to build really strong components that then could be reused in the development. And so I'm always amazed when you see anything being built in the physical landscape, that the foundation takes so long and then all of a sudden the building pops up. And for me, it has very much been like that in this whole process, that the foundations take a long time because you need to get them right. You need to do the accessibility audit. You need to go through those conversations about hypotheses and why you're doing something a certain way. And then you build all the components as part of the foundation, and then all of a sudden you have an app that pops up. So it's not quite all of a sudden. It still takes time, but it's definitely faster in that part than the foundations. So yeah, build was good.
Great.
And still happening.
And so you mentioned there are sort of 250 users. Can you tell us what it feels like for them using it? What's their sort of feedback, strengths and weaknesses maybe?
Yeah. Feedback so far has been mixed, which is good. It's been feedback that it's very useful and that this is a problem that they've been waiting to solve for a very long time, and that they can see the value of this in starting to help solve the problem. But then also feedback that there's some things that are challenging around it. Even though we've tried our best to make it accessible, there's still further things we can do to make it more accessible. We've had feedback around how to define the starting point of what is a preference, because a preference could be, as I mentioned before, it could be toast, what's on your toast, or it could be, end-of-life care planning. So when you're coming in, having more prompts and guidance in maybe starting small and then layering up, which we don't have enough of that yet. So that's all incredibly valuable feedback and exactly what we want to hear. If we were only getting feedback saying, oh, it's great, we love it, I might be a little bit concerned by that because I might think that's not real. And so the feedback that we want more than anything is the feedback that tells us and steers us the direction that we need to go.
That's fantastic, because that really is the purpose of design, right? It's about iteration. When I had to create art, we had to create a thing and see whether it works for people. And so the fact that it's not perfect means that there's so much more that could be made better. It's really interesting because what you're describing is, so we kind of designed a tool where we aim to make it as easy as possible to capture, your preference. And then that kind of highlights that being able to even articulate a preference and the decision makers. So how do they go through the process of making that decision? That's kind of what the design, that process needs to help them walk that path of well, what do I like for breakfast? It's not as straightforward as saying, I want to declare this. Yes, that's really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think that this is exactly the type of conversation that we're wanting decision makers to have. And potentially part of the reason why it's hard is because it might be also unfamiliar. And that's part of our mission, is to empower disabled decision makers to be able to articulate and communicate what their preferences are, including in nonverbal expressions of preferences, to have the expectation that those will be honoured and respected. And that might be new. Unfortunately, it's really sad to say, but that's exactly why we're doing this. And so part of the difficulty is bigger than the app. It's the whole shift that we're wanting to move. And we just need to make sure that we are not a barrier to the shift, but we're definitely helping it to go along.
That's wonderful. Erika, Dan, thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you, and we'd love to hear more about your journey as time goes on.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.